Today's topics about preparing for NATO's 2014 summit under the spell of the Ukraine crisis, discussed by Thomas Rees, Jamie Shea, Dr. Peter van Ham, Isabelle François, Professor Dr. Coco Lijn and Dick Sandé, were set in two themes. The first one is about NATO's post-Afghanistan status, rebalancing the core tasks, and the second, NATO's capabilities towards a stronger military NATO.
But basically, the return of Russia does not need to be a problem. If it was like Poland or Estonia, no problem. The problem is the character of the Kremlin. They think in terms of brute power politics, and for anyone who has been looking at Russian domestic affairs, there's simply no excuse since 2000 of not being aware of that. It's a very strong leadership. Putin is no fool, he's very strong. Tremendous tactical cunning and a total strategic disaster. And I say that tactical, I mean Crimea is a brilliant tactical move from this point of view. He turned potential disaster for himself into a temporary success, but strategic disaster because he's unable to modernize the Russian economy. And that in the long run is the name of the game. Without that, Russia's not going to do well. And that does not develop in Russian society. But the Russian economy does provide the money that a dictatorship needs to do what it wants to do. Just a quick reminder, 4th of July, 1 year ago, the Russians were preparing the 2014 budget. They realized that the revenues were not going to be as much as they thought, so what did they do? They cut the budget of the health and education ministries in order to maintain the increased spending on defense. And no democratic European country could do that in normal times, but a dictatorship can. And everything the EU stands for, democracy, respect for human rights, free media, etc., is a direct mortal threat to the ability of the Putin regime to stay in power in Russia. This is an endemic, very profound contradiction and challenge between the Putin regime and us. It's much more alien than we thought, we're willing to think. It's much more hostile than we thought for some of these reasons, and it's dangerous. The good news is that Putin is also, he's clever, he's realpolitical, he's a man you can trade horses with. That's a good thing. He's not a nutcase, but he's hard, and we are not. What has been happening in Europe? Well, in Finland we tend to say that there are two Europes when it comes to Russia. We have Europe that's east of Berlin, we call it. And here I've only got the northern, central European countries. Every European country that has a direct land border with Russia has a very, very different view of Russia from the rest of Europe. And of course, four of these, the four former Warsaw Pact countries, have a very, very hard view. West of Berlin, and particularly Berlin itself, we have a very different view of Russia, or have had. West of Berlin, first of all, right up until Ukraine, we have been tremendously naive about Russia. And this has to do with two things. One, we have a generation of politicians now, since 1989, that has come in with the myth of the end of history. The idea that great power conflicts are unthinkable. Basically, it's a non-zero-sum game. We can all get along. The possibility of interstate war is over. Now it's other kinds of war. This myth has permeated a whole political generation. And this political generation, which is now running us, and that goes from Washington to Europe, is simply unable to think in power political terms. And that's a real problem. They're totally unable to understand how Putin sees the world. Secondly, when we have been confronted with things which we simply could not explain away in these non-zero-sum terms, like for instance Georgia 2008, we've just been arrogant. We say, well, it doesn't matter, okay, if he kills his journalists and whatever, it goes into Georgia. Russia is anyway a rinky-dink, basically third world kind of country. It really doesn't matter, they're weak. And third, we've been ignorant about history. We've been looking only forward, not backwards. And then fourth, which is a very legitimate, good excuse, we have been distracted legitimately by our economic crisis since 2008 and by the terrorist challenge and the Balkans before that. So we have been distracted, that's legitimate. But basically what we've done is we've mirror imaged the Putin regime, and that is fatal. They are not at all like us. But what is the crisis about? Well, the crisis is not just the Ukraine. This is the first clash, civilization is a slightly wrong word, but two regimes with fundamentally different worldviews and vital interests, which are very difficult to reconcile. Second, the stakes are not just in Ukraine. This is not just about Eastern Ukraine. It's about the future of the European political order, and whether Putin will be giving the orders. And the point here is that I'm absolutely convinced Putin didn't want to do what he did in Crimea. He was forced to do it because the alternative was worse. He would have probably lost his domestic power, and he couldn't afford to let Ukraine simply possibly move westwards. So he had to do it. That meant that he had to precipitate a trend in Europe which he rather wouldn't have revealed, and we'll look at that later. Third, the crisis marks the end of liberal Western rule in Europe. And one thing we should be clear about is we have ruled Europe roughshod with our liberal values. We've not taken any consideration of Russian interests at all because we've simply assumed that they should be the same as ours. And this is the end. Putin has challenged Western soft governance with very hard power. And secondly, he's now launching an ideological offensive which is resonating among European publics that are shaken by their domestic problems. And we saw that in the recent European parliamentary elections. Extremist parties got a lot of power, and many of them are flattening and applauding Putin. So that's the final thing. And this is what Putin was building up, and this is, of course, what he didn't want to reveal or wouldn't like to show until it was ready. And I would say in about 10 years' time. 10 years' time from now, he can start leaning on us really heavily. And the Crimea, of course, woke us up to that potential. So the challenge on the one hand is to avoid Russian domination, and that means that we have to learn again, we have to play Putin's game, and we don't know how to do that. We know how to play the non-zero-sum game. We don't know how to play the zero-sum game. We're going to have to learn that again, power politics. And that means also confrontation. On the other hand, we don't want a second Cold War, we don't want to escalate more than we have to, and so on. So that means mutual respect. But we can only respect the Russian way of looking at the world if we understand it, and we don't. And they have lots, I won't go into that now, we can in the discussion, they have lots of tremendously good arguments for why they're doing what they're doing. And that means also compromise. But compromise on both sides' terms, including ours, and that's where we get into things like Ukraine and how far we go. And so there are obviously a lot of real problems there. And that's it. The great game is back, but we no longer know how to play. And that ends my presentation. Thanks.
The key issue today is how to deal with Russia and Ukraine. Just a couple of quick points in the brief time I have available. Number one, let's look back at the Cold War. Tom mentioned this, and I agree. Not because history repeats itself, as Mark Twain said, although it does occasionally rhyme, but because there are certain things that could be relevant. A few examples. Number one, during the Cold War, we did look at land grabs. We had lots of contingency plans for dealing with a land grab of West Berlin or border incursions and so on. The problem of little green men, of deceptive attacks was part of Soviet military doctrine. Putin hasn't invented anything new. Everybody's pretending there's something new called 21st century warfare. But the Soviets also used information tactics, sabotage tactics, military exercises, which would lead, think of Czechoslovakia in 1968, into a full-scale form of aggression, instrumentalization of minorities, agents of influence, friendly NGOs, economic dependencies, gas and energy were part of the mix in the 1980s as well, believe me. And NATO did have at that time contingency plans for dealing with this, so let's not pretend it's all new. Albert Camus used to say man has very few original ideas, and I tend to agree. Let's look back at that and see what is still useful. Example number two, the ACE mobile force. If the problem is today a reaction time in terms of moving NATO forces from Western Europe back into Central and Eastern Europe, let's look at what we had then, which was a 2,000-person force permanently under the command of Sacco for immediate deployment. Let's look again at how we did situational awareness. During the Cold War, we had a lot of people looking at Russian military doctrine. Almost nobody does that today. Very few people in our intelligence services or in our academic institutions are involved in that. It's been a lost science. It used to be called Sovietology. We haven't been, and Tom was right, looking at Russian military doctrine or particularly taking it seriously. We hadn't picked up how Russia, in the wake of 2008, had transformed its conventional forces and modernized, largely on the basis of Western technology, let it be said. If there's a big difference between the Soviet Union, which made entirely its own military equipment, and today virtually every aspect of Russian military technology is Western imported. Very little is Russian any longer. And certainly what we knew about situational awareness and mobilizing the academic community and the think tank community to to enhance our situational awareness and understand not just how we see deterrence, but how our potential adversary perceives the credibility of our deterrence. Because, like beauty, deterrence is purely in the eye of the beholder. There are certain things we can get back to. Let me give you a third example of where the Cold War can help us. Standing defence plans, which we don't have anymore in NATO. In other words, defence plans which are backed up by the commitment of forces. Today, a NATO plan doesn't have pre-assigned forces. It's rather like a UN peacekeeping operation. That once you expedite the plan, you have to go and find forces to fill those slots, like we've been doing in Afghanistan and the Balkans. But during the Cold War, we had units that were assigned to a certain mission and a certain plan, who trained for that, who were ready for it as well. So first thing, let's look a little bit at what we did before and what's still useful. Next thing that we need to do is rapidly sort out what we are going to do with reassurance in Central and Eastern Europe. Another group of allies would believe that we can do the long-term reassurance pretty much on the basis of the current sort of rotations in and out of Central and Eastern Europe. Waving the flag, temporary deployment, ships in the Black Sea for 3 weeks at a time under the Montreux Convention, then back out, and keep this up. The advantage, as they see it, of this second option is what they call scalability. That if tomorrow Russia comes to its senses and says, sorry, we got it wrong, we're evacuating Crimea, we want to go back to the situation, status quo ante, we want to resume cooperation, then unlike bricks and mortar, which have a certain permanence about them, exercises can quickly be scaled down, scalability, and therefore we can decrease this posture quickly. It's really sort of based, if you like, on an assumption that one day we will resume a strategic partnership with Russia, or the assumption that no, we're now in a new strategic paradigm where we are likely to be in a more confrontational posture for some time, and we have to adapt accordingly. This is a genuine debate. I don't belittle either side's good intentions or honesty in conducting that debate, but it must not become a paralysing debate for NATO. We have to find an effective way forward on that, which both allows for a scalability of measures, and but also, by the way, does not recreate a Cold War style territorial defence, heavy metal Cold War army in Eastern Europe. That wouldn't serve our purposes, because I mentioned the South. There will be other interventions, believe me. You know, even President Obama now said never again about Iraq. And look what he announced last night. You know, of course, it doesn't mean US combat forces, but it clearly shows events, dear boy, events, to quote Harold Macmillan, will continue to rule. And we therefore should keep to an expeditionary type of force, which can do both the Article 5 and the non-Article 5. But one of the key tasks of the summit, look out for this as a success criteria, is that we find an effective way forward on this. The next issue is going to be deterrence itself. What is deterrence today? What does it mean? You know, is it the same as when we left it in 1989? You know, do we just sort of go back to that with essentially tanks and conventional forces and reservists? Or is deterrence different today? And this is going to be a big issue. We've spoken about deterrence in theoretical terms, you know, an appropriate mix of nuclear and conventional weapons, but for several years we didn't have to do it. And therefore we've lost, if you like, our feeling.
You've mentioned that the South may cause a bit more problems for NATO than the East. Why is this?
Well, I think that in the South, first of all, we have threats which are very real in the sense that we're being affected by them every day. Every day, foreign fighters who have been in Syria come back to France, come back to the UK, Belgium, other European countries. Every day now we seem to have new terrorist attacks taking place in the Sahel as the Al-Qaeda organisation multiplies and reconstitutes itself in that part of the world. We also have increasingly this nexus between climate change, population and demographic growth, social economic factors, together with organised crime and jihadism. There's no surprise that where countries have a very strong jihadist implantation, you're also seeing, for example, diseases like polio coming back, state breakdown and so on. And of course, every day, hundreds of illegal immigrants are heading across the Mediterranean. So we have to be aware that the problems of the south are already with us and have been with us for some time, which is not to say that we should not underestimate the significance of the annexation of Crimea or the seriousness of what President Putin and Russia have done. It's simply to say that we need to ride two horses at the same time.
So what is the best approach to deal with the East?
Well, with the East, I think we need to do three things. Number one, first of all, make it very clear that nobody should meddle with NATO. NATO is an alliance which is very serious about defending its members and is demonstrating that every day by enhancing its military presence on the territory of our new member states. The second thing we need to do is to be clear with Russia that we're not going to go back to business as usual. Many Russians think that, like after Georgia, we will huff and puff for a couple of weeks and then afterwards we'll recognize the annexation of Crimea, and because of economic or other interests we'll go back to business as usual. It's very important that we show not just the Putin regime but also the Russian people that there are consequences, real consequences from this type of behavior, and therefore when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to a more transactional relationship with Russia, we must stop talking about a strategic partnership where it clearly doesn't exist. We have to be prepared for the long haul until such time as Russia rejoins the international community. The third thing, though, which to my mind is the most urgent, is that we have to look at the countries in between. This is not the Cold War. We don't have NATO here and the Warsaw Pact next door. We have a number of countries in between: Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and you could name others. And we need to do what we can to make those countries more resilient, better able to withstand Russian pressures, help them with their security sector reform, with their borders, with their economy. It's just not only, in my mind, a moral obligation, it's also our security interest to have those states as friends of the West, as integrated into the West, even if they're not necessarily going to join NATO or the European Union in the near future.